In a limestone quarry in southern Germany, a fossil lay encased in rock. At first glance, it appears ordinary. Another ancient creature, perfectly preserved, frozen in time for 150 million years. But look closer, the limbs are twisted in ways that defy logic. The neck is contorted at an impossible angle. The tail curves backward, as if the animal was seized by violent spasms long after its heart stopped beating. For over a century, paleontologists dismissed these strange postures as artifacts of fossilization, quirks of geological pressure, or the final throes of drowning. But the truth is far stranger. These fossils moved after death, their bodies twisted, contracted, and repositioned themselves through a mechanism so unsettling that when researchers first published their findings, the scientific establishment tried to bury it. This wasn't decomposition. It wasn't scavengers. It was something that challenges everything we understand about the boundary between life and death. The phenomenon has a name: post-mortem fetal positioning, or the death pose. It appears in countless fossils across the world, from tiny dinosaurs to massive sauropods, from ancient birds to marine reptiles. The pattern is always the same: head thrown back, spine arched, limbs contracted, tail curled. It looks like agony frozen in stone. For decades, scientists believed they were witnessing the final moments of dying animals, creatures drowning in ancient floods or suffocating in volcanic ash. But in 2007, a team of researchers conducted an experiment that would shatter this comfortable explanation. They took dead chickens and placed them in water, replicating the conditions under which many fossils formed. Then they watched, and what they witnessed was impossible. Days after death, with no muscle function, no nervous system activity, no life remaining in the tissue, the bodies began to move. Heads bent backward, necks arched, limbs drew inward. The chickens were assuming the death pose, not in their final living moments, but in the days and weeks after they died. The implications were staggering. If this was happening to chickens, it had happened to dinosaurs. It had happened to pterosaurs. It had happened to ancient birds and reptiles across millions of years. The fossils we've been studying, the ones we thought captured the final agonized seconds of prehistoric life, were actually showing us something that occurred long after death. A macabre puppet show, orchestrated by forces that operate beyond the cessation of life. The scientific community reacted with skepticism bordering on hostility. Papers were rejected. Grant proposals were denied. Some researchers claimed the findings threatened to undermine decades of paleontological interpretation. But the evidence was undeniable. And as more teams replicated the experiments, as more fossils were re-examined through this new lens, a disturbing picture emerged. Death, it turns out, is not the end of movement. To understand how we got here, we must go back to the very beginning of this mystery. The story begins in 1861, in the Solnhofen limestone beds of Bavaria. Workers splitting slabs of fine, grained rock discovered something extraordinary. The fossilized remains of a creature that seemed to be half bird, half reptile. They named it Archaeopteryx, and it would become one of the most important fossils in the history of science. But there was something odd about its preservation. The neck was bent backward at an extreme angle, the head nearly touching the spine. The tail curved upward and back. The limbs were drawn tight against the body. It looked like the creature had died in terrible pain. Over the following decades, paleontologists found this posture again and again. Small theropod dinosaurs, frozen in the same contorted position. Juvenile Coelophysis, necks hyperextended. Baby Sauromus, bodies twisted into impossible curves. The pattern was unmistakable, and the explanation seemed obvious: these animals had drowned. Water entering the lungs would cause convulsions, muscle spasms, and the characteristic backward bend of the neck. It was called the drowning hypothesis, and for nearly a century, it dominated paleontological thinking. But there were problems with this theory from the start. Not all fossils showing the death pose were found in aquatic environments. Some were preserved in desert sandstones, in volcanic ash, in terrestrial mudstones far from any ancient body of water. And the mechanics didn't quite add up. Drowning causes certain muscle contractions, yes, but not with the consistency and severity seen in the fossil record. Something else was happening. In the early 2000s, paleontologist Cynthia Marshall Fox began questioning the drowning hypothesis. She had been studying small theropod fossils from the Two Medicine Formation in Montana, and she noticed something disturbing. The death pose appeared in fossils from completely different environments. Creatures that died in floods showed it. Creatures that died in dry lakebeds showed it. Creatures that were clearly buried rapidly in volcanic ash showed it. If drowning was the cause, why did it happen to animals that never encountered water? Fox proposed a radical alternative. The movement was happening after death, driven by the desiccation and contraction of ligaments and tendons as the body dried out. The scientific community was not receptive. Papers describing the phenomenon were rejected by major journals. Reviewers claimed the hypothesis was speculative, unsupported, potentially damaging to established interpretations of fossil behavior and ecology. Some went further, suggesting that accepting post-mortem movement would invalidate decades of research into dinosaur death assemblages and taxonomy. The resistance was fierce, but Fox persisted, and in 2007 she partnered with Kevin Padian, a prominent paleontologist at the University of California, Berkeley, to conduct a definitive experiment. They obtained freshly deceased chickens and submerged them in water tanks, monitoring them continuously. At first, nothing happened. The birds floated, limbs loose, necks extended naturally. Then, over the course of several days, something changed. The heads began to tilt backward. Slowly at first, then more dramatically. The necks curved, vertebrae by vertebrae, until the skulls were nearly touching the backs. The legs drew inward. The wings folded tighter. Within 2 weeks, the chickens had assumed the classic death pose, identical to the position seen in Archaeopteryx fossils, and they did it without any muscle activity whatsoever. The mechanism was purely mechanical, driven by the dehydration of ligaments connecting the vertebrae. As water left the tissues, the ligaments contracted, pulling the bones into new positions. The process was irreversible and inevitable. The findings were published in the journal Paleobiology, and the implications rippled through the field. Across the world, researchers began re-examining fossil collections through this new lens. A team in China studied Microraptor specimens. A group in Argentina analyzed juvenile titanosaur fossils. Museums in Europe revisited their Archaeopteryx holdings. Everywhere they looked, the pattern held. The death pose was post-mortem. It was mechanical, and it had been happening for hundreds of millions of years. The first chapter of this story takes us deeper into the mechanics of what happens when complex organisms die. Life, in the biological sense, is not an on-off switch. It's a gradient, a spectrum of processes that shut down at different rates. When the heart stops, when the brain ceases to function, when respiration ends, we call it death. But at the cellular level, at the tissue level, things continue. Cells consume the last reserves of oxygen. Chemical reactions proceed. And in the structural components of the body, particularly in the ligaments and tendons that hold the skeleton together, physical processes continue that can generate surprising forces. Ligaments are composed primarily of collagen, a protein that gives them strength and flexibility. In life, these tissues are hydrated, supple, capable of stretching and recoiling. But after death, as the body is exposed to air or submerged in water, these tissues begin to lose moisture. Water molecules escape through evaporation or osmosis. As the collagen fibers dry, they contract. It's the same principle that causes leather to shrink or wood to warp. But in a dead animal, this contraction doesn't happen uniformly. The ligaments along the dorsal side of the neck, the ones that support the head in life, are particularly thick and robust. When they dry, they contract with considerable force, pulling the skull backward toward the spine. In 2023, a team at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich conducted a detailed biomechanical analysis of this process using computer models. They simulated the drying of neck ligaments in various dinosaur species, calculating the forces generated and the resulting vertebral displacement. The results were stunning. In small theropods like Velociraptor, ligament contraction could generate forces exceeding 10 times the weight of the head, more than enough to pull the neck into extreme hyperextension. In larger animals, the forces were even greater. A juvenile sauropod, its neck ligaments drying in the sun, could develop enough tension to bend its neck into a nearly perfect arc, skull touching the base of the tail. But the research revealed something even more disturbing. The death pose doesn't just happen in air. It happens underwater. It happens buried in sediment. It happens in virtually any environment where the body is not immediately consumed or rapidly fossilized. The key factor is time. Given enough time for tissue desiccation to begin, the mechanism activates. And once it starts, it's irreversible. The ligaments contract, the vertebrae shift, and the body assumes a new configuration that has nothing to do with the animal's final living moments. This realization forced paleontologists to confront an uncomfortable truth. For over a century, they had been interpreting fossil postures as behavior. A dinosaur with its neck thrown back was thought to be drowning, struggling for air. A creature with limbs drawn tight was assumed to be in the throes of death, muscles contracting in final spasms. But these interpretations were wrong. The fossils weren't showing behavior at all. They were showing physics. The inexorable mechanical processes that reshape bodies after life ends. And this meant that countless scientific papers, museum displays, and popular depictions of dinosaur death were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The second chapter takes us into the fossil record itself, to the countless specimens that preserve this post-mortem phenomenon. Consider the famous fighting dinosaurs of Mongolia, a velociraptor and protoceratops locked in eternal combat, discovered in 1971. The velociraptor's neck is dramatically arched backward, head thrown to the side. For decades, this was interpreted as the animal's final living posture, perhaps a defensive reaction or the result of a fatal bite. But under the new understanding, this posture tells a different story. The velociraptor likely died in a more neutral position. Then, as the body dried in the Gobi Desert sands, the neck ligaments contracted, pulling the head back. The dramatic posture we see is not from the battle, but from the days and weeks that followed. The same pattern appears in one of paleontology's most controversial specimens, the so-called dueling dinosaurs, a Nanotyrannus and Triceratops found together in Montana. Both animals display the death pose. Both have necks arched severely backward. The original interpretation suggested they killed each other, dying simultaneously in a final violent encounter. But if the postures are post-mortem, this narrative collapses. The animals might have died together or separately. The twisted necks tell us nothing about their final moments, only about what happened afterward in 2024. Researchers at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta published a comprehensive survey of death pose occurrence across the fossil record. They examined over 3,000 specimens from museum collections worldwide. The results were remarkable. The death pose appeared in approximately 65% of all well-preserved vertebrate fossils. It was found in every major dinosaur group: theropods, sauropods, ornithopods, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs. It appeared in pterosaurs, in early birds, and marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs. The phenomenon was not limited to dinosaurs or even to the Mesozoic. Fossils of Cenozoic mammals showed it. Ancient fish displayed it. Even some exceptionally preserved Paleozoic amphibians exhibited the characteristic backward, bent neck. But here's where it gets strange. Not all fossils show the death pose, and the ones that don't reveal something crucial about the fossilization process. Animals that were rapidly buried, covered in sediment within hours or days of death, often preserve in more natural positions. The death pose requires time for tissues to dry, for ligaments to contract, for the body to reconfigure itself. If burial happens too quickly, the mechanism never activates. This creates a paradox for paleontologists. The most dramatic eye-catching fossils, the ones with exaggerated postures that seem to tell a story, are actually less reliable as windows into ancient behavior. The boring fossils, the ones in neutral positions, are more likely to show us how these animals actually died. The implications extend beyond individual fossils to entire death assemblages. Consider the Ghost Ranch Coelophysis quarry in New Mexico, where hundreds of small theropod dinosaurs are preserved in a single layer. Many show the death pose. The original interpretation was mass drowning, a flash flood that caught an entire population and killed them simultaneously. But if the postures are post-mortem, this interpretation needs revision. The animals might have died over days or weeks, their bodies accumulating in a depression that eventually flooded. Or they might have died simultaneously, but been exposed on a mudflat long enough for ligament contraction to occur before final burial. The death pose doesn't tell us how they died. It tells us how long they lay dead before fossilization. The third chapter brings us to the cutting edge of this research, to discoveries made in just the last few years that have pushed the phenomenon into even stranger territory. In 2022, paleontologists working in the Geological biota of China, those extraordinary fossil beds that preserve feathers, skin, and sometimes even internal organs, made a discovery that shouldn't have been possible. They found a small dinosaur, a juvenile Sinosauropteryx, preserved in the death pose. But this animal was fossilized so rapidly, buried in volcanic ash so quickly, that soft tissue should have been intact. The ligaments should not have had time to dry and contract, and yet there it was, neck thrown back, tail curled, limbs drawn in. Something else was happening. The research team, led by Dr. Xiaoli Wang at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, conducted a detailed analysis of the fossil's microstructure. What they found was unexpected. The ligaments had not desiccated in the traditional sense. Instead, they had undergone a rapid chemical change, a process called protein cross-linking. In the extreme heat of the volcanic eruption, the collagen molecules in the ligaments had been partially cooked, causing them to bond together and contract almost instantaneously. The death pose had formed not over days but over hours, perhaps even minutes. The animal had been killed by the eruption, and its body had twisted into the characteristic posture before it was even cold. This discovery opened up a new avenue of research. If heat could trigger rapid ligament contraction, what other environmental factors might influence the death pose? A team at the University of Edinburgh began studying fossils from different climatic zones, comparing specimens preserved in hot, arid environments with those from cool, humid regions. They found significant differences. Fossils from desert environments showed more extreme death poses, with necks bent at sharper angles. Fossils from wetter environments showed milder contortions. Temperature, humidity, and the rate of tissue desiccation all played roles in determining the final posture. But the most unsettling discovery came in 2025, from a collaboration between paleontologists and forensic scientists. The team based at Texas A&M University was studying the death pose phenomenon when they realized something troubling. They had seen this before, not in fossils, but in modern forensic cases. Human bodies, under certain conditions, can also assume contorted postures after death. It's rare, usually occurring in cases where bodies are exposed to extreme heat or prolonged desiccation. But when it happens, the postures are eerily similar to those seen in dinosaur fossils: neck hyperextension, limb contraction, spinal arching. The same biomechanical forces that twisted dinosaurs 150 million years ago are still operating today, in modern environments, in modern bodies. The forensic team began consulting on paleontological research, bringing expertise in post-mortem biomechanics to the study of ancient fossils. They helped develop new protocols for distinguishing between ante-mortem postures, positions that animals assumed while still alive, and post-mortem reconfiguration. The work is painstaking, requiring detailed analysis of bone stress markers, ligament attachment sites, and sediment structure around the fossil. But it's revolutionizing how paleontologists interpret their finds. We're learning to read fossils not just as snapshots of death, but as records of the entire taphonomic process, the journey from living animal to preserved specimen. Now we arrive at the grand reveal, the synthesis that ties everything together and reveals why this discovery was so controversial, why some researchers tried to suppress it, why it matters far beyond paleontology. The death pose isn't just about fossils. It's about how we construct narratives from evidence, how we project our assumptions onto the past, and how even rigorous science can be blinded by expectations. For over a century, paleontologists looked at contorted fossils and saw drama: dying animals, final struggles, moments of agony and terror. They built elaborate hypotheses around these postures. They used them to infer behavior, ecology, even cognition. Fossils with necks thrown back were evidence of aquatic deaths. Twisted limbs suggested predator attacks. Arched spines indicated poisoning or disease. An entire interpretive framework was constructed on a foundation of misunderstood biomechanics. As the death pose revelation forces us to dismantle much of this framework. It doesn't mean fossils tell us nothing about ancient life. They remain our primary window into deep time. But it means we must be more cautious, more skeptical, more willing to question our interpretations. The dramatic fossil that seems to tell a story might be telling us nothing about the animal's life or death. It might only be showing us what happened afterward, in the days and weeks when the body lay exposed, when physics took over from biology, when ligaments dried and contracted, and pulled bones into positions they never held in life. This changes everything we thought we understood about fossil preservation. It affects how we interpret death assemblages, how we reconstruct ancient environments, even how we estimate population dynamics in extinct species. If many fossils are post-mortem reconfigurations, then our assumptions about how animals died, where they died, and what killed them need revision. The mass drownings we inferred from death pose fossils might not have been drownings at all. The battle scenes we reconstructed from intertwined skeletons might be artifacts of burial, not combat. The evidence of pain and suffering we thought we saw frozen in stone might be nothing more than the mechanical consequences of tissue desiccation. But the greatest mystery still remains. Why does the death pose happen so consistently? Why do bodies of such different sizes, from creatures as small as sparrows to animals weighing dozens of tons, all assume remarkably similar postures? The answer lies in the fundamental architecture of the vertebrate body plan. We all share the same basic skeletal structure, inherited from our common ancestors hundreds of millions of years ago. We all have necks supported by dorsal ligaments, spines that curve, limbs that flex. When these structures are subject to the same mechanical forces after death, they respond in predictable ways. The death pose is not a mystery of biology. It's a consequence of geometry, physics, and the shared evolutionary history that links birds to dinosaurs, mammals to reptiles, all of us to the deep past. Looking forward, this research is opening entirely new directions in paleontology. Scientists are now developing computational models that can predict the death pose for different species based on their anatomy, size, and likely preservation environment. These models can be run in reverse, taking a fossil in death pose and calculating backward to determine its likely original position. This reverse engineering is revealing new insights into dinosaur posture, gait, and behavior that were previously obscured by post-mortem distortion. We're essentially learning to see through the death pose, to reconstruct the living animal from the distorted fossil. At the same time, the research is influencing fields far beyond paleontology. Forensic scientists are using insights from fossil studies to better understand modern death investigations. Archaeologists are re-examining ancient human burials with new questions about post-mortem body positioning. Even space agencies are interested. Understanding how bodies change configuration in the absence of scavengers and normal decomposition processes has implications for long-duration space missions and the potential discovery of extraterrestrial fossils. The future holds remarkable possibilities. As imaging technology advances, we're gaining the ability to see inside fossils without destroying them, to visualize the three-dimensional arrangement of bones and identify post-mortem movement with unprecedented precision. CT scanning, synchrotron imaging, and advanced photogrammetry are revealing details of fossil preservation that were invisible to previous generations of scientists. We're entering an era where we can reconstruct not just what animals looked like, but how their bodies transformed after death, creating a complete narrative of fossilization from the final heartbeat to the moment of discovery millions of years later. But questions remain. We still don't fully understand why some fossils resist the death pose. We're still investigating whether bacterial activity in decomposing tissue might accelerate or inhibit ligament contraction. We're still debating whether very large animals, like the biggest sauropods, could generate enough ligament force to overcome their enormous neck mass and assume the classic posture. Each answer leads to new questions. Each solved mystery reveals deeper complexities. The story of the death pose is ultimately a story about humility in science, about the necessity of questioning even our most fundamental assumptions. It reminds us that the fossil record is not a transparent window into the past, but a complex, distorted lens shaped by countless taphonomic processes we're still learning to understand. Every fossil is a puzzle, and the posture might be the least reliable clue. The real information is encoded in subtler features, the microscopic structure of bone, the chemical composition of surrounding sediment, the statistical patterns across hundreds of specimens. As we continue to refine our understanding of post-mortem biomechanics, we're not losing the wonder of fossils. We're deepening it. The Archaeopteryx with its neck thrown back is no less extraordinary because we know the posture formed after death. If anything, it's more remarkable. We're not just seeing an ancient bird. We're seeing the operation of physical laws that remained constant across 150 million years. Forces that connect the deep past to the present in tangible, measurable ways. The fossil is a time machine, but it's showing us physics as much as biology, process as much as form. In the end, the death pose teaches us that death is not a moment, but a process, not an ending, but a transition. The boundary between life and death is hazier than we imagine, blurred by chemical reactions that continue, by tissues that keep changing, by bodies that keep moving long after consciousness ceases. The fossils we study are not death masks, capturing a final instant. They are records of journeys, transformations that unfolded over days and weeks as dead bodies became geological objects. They are snapshots not of dying but of becoming, of the strange liminal zone between biology and geology, between what once lived and what will forever be stone. Because in the end, the universe always has another secret waiting, another assumption ready to be overturned, another mystery hiding in plain sight in museum drawers and limestone quarries around the world. The fossils haven't changed, but our understanding of what they mean keeps evolving, keeps deepening, keeps revealing how much we still have to learn about the deep past and the strange, inexorable processes that transform life into stone. The death pose is no longer a mystery, but every answer opens 1,000 new questions. And that is how science advances, one overturned assumption at a time, one controversial discovery at a time, one impossible fossil at a time.